The Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum, Australia's first attempt at constitutional change since 1990, has been overwhelmingly rejected around the country in a pre-Halloween horror show, challenging many to try and understand it, as prophesied in the 1986 song You're the Voice by clairvoyant former pop star John Farnham. Prime Minister Albanese's voice was billed as a historic moment for national unity, a chance to right the wrongs of our colonial past and recognise Indigenous Australians in the nation's constitution. However, many viewed the mandated parliamentary advisory body as divisive and were apprehensive about permanently changing the constitution without first understanding details such as how the voice would operate, what its scope would be, who would be in it, whether it would provide a pathway to treaty and reparations, how it would be funded, when it would close the gap between Indigenous and other.
Oh, that's right, Brian. 65% of Australians started out in favour of Albo's voice proposal just last year, but support has consistently dwindled throughout the campaign, culminating in only 39% of Australians voting in favour of the proposal at the referendum, and defeat in every state and territory, except for Canberra, of course.
What's a Canberra?
Australia's capital, Brian.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Former Iron and Tonight host Larry Fillmore was an active campaigner for the Yes movement and took questions from the press after results became clear, shortly after voting started.
Over here, Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore!
Over here.
All right. It seems clear Australians weren't convinced that the scope of the voice was contained within the one-page Uluru Statement. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, what I will say is we've had the chance to turn the pages over. You can write what you want to write, but we got to make ends meet before we get much older.
Mr. Fillmore, Mr. Fillmore, which demographics were most to blame for this result?
Listen, I want to be clear. We're all someone's daughter. We're all someone's son. How long are we going to look at each other,
down the barrel of a gun?
Well, that seems a bit harsh.
Mr. Fillmore, have you heard from the Prime Minister yet? How's he feeling after the vote?
Yes, I have spoken to Albo, and I said,
You're the voice, mate. We all understand it.
but they made a noise, and wait, hold on. God, who's this bozo? Are you not going to sit in silence, mate? Sure, can we get rid of this guy? We're not going to live in fear here, bud. All right, I'll take one more question.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore, what would you say to Indigenous people that might be feeling a bit let down by the Yes movement and Labor's handling of the referendum tonight?
Look, I just want to say we're all confident, very confident, that next time, we all stand together. We've got the power to be powerful and believe that we can make it better. Well, no, I wouldn't go that far.
Oh. So the answers were inside John Farnham's You're the Voice after all, even though the ads featuring the song didn't quite sway voters.
No, they didn't, but the song was a wonderful metaphor for what transpired during this referendum. A hit idea imported from overseas that got wildly popular with Aussies until it was so overplayed it lost its substance, and was then exploited to try to sell a product that wasn't what people wanted.
Advertising. Anyway, Kristinia Solich took a deeper look into the voice and its slow fall from sure thing to in the bin.
Try and understand it. The poignant words in the chorus of Australia's proxy national anthem. But as the votes were tallied in Australia's voice referendum, exactly who needs to understand what is still very much up for debate. Over 60% of Australia rejected the voice, despite heavy backing for over a year by almost every media, corporate, celebrity and institutional entity in the country. Worldwide media quickly blamed misinformation and racism for the result. Yes voters kept their posters up in formation, ruining the No campaign's masterful strategy of using actual Indigenous people to deliver their message. and the mainstream media are still wondering how their time and money failed to get a majority information with The Voice. The ABC's Patricia Karvalis could barely contain her anger, interviewing former Labor President turned Liberal MP Warren Mundine.
Warren Mundine, you've certainly won tonight. Is reconciliation now dead in this country? The No campaign ran a dirty campaign of lies, dividing on racial division. That's not factual. Indigenous people are heartbroken. Many, not all. Clearly you're not. But what's your message to Indigenous Australians? Warren Mundine, I'm going to throw back to Sydney, Bridget.
Nor could Channel 9's 60 Minutes reporter Amelia Adams, while she interviewed opposition leader Peter Dutton.
How did you feel when you woke up this morning? Your campaign is being labelled today as disgusting and shameful. How does that sit with you? The voice to Parliament was pretty straightforward and it's been killed by politics. Australians are baffled. How do you think this result impacts our international reputation? Isn't this idea that Australia is racist and discriminatory? It's exactly the type of disinformation that China has been spreading online. Isn't this result a gift to the CCP? Okay, so where to from here, given that our Parliament is not willing to hear from Indigenous Australians on issues that affect them?
Well, I just don't think that's the case.
We asked Prime Minister Anthony Albanese for an interview, but he said no.
Liberal Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price copped heavy criticism for using her own voice during the Voice campaign.
No to grievance and the push from activists to suggest that we are a racist country when we are absolutely not.
And Victoria's Indigenous Senator Lydia Thorpe wasn't going to be in formation with anyone.
All I want to say to the black brothers there, any black man that stands with a white little like that, you can all get...
How the did someone get in Parliament like you?
But perhaps it was Tasmanian Aboriginal activist and lawyer Michael Mansell who best summed up the referendum on ABC's post-vote Wake program.
This was an awful campaign. You might recall all the ads showing disadvantage, and then somehow stitching that to the advisory body as a solution. They just expected people to jump on board emotionally if you are not a racist, and at no stage did the Yes campaign explain how an advisory body could do that which the Prime Minister, state governments and the peak organisations couldn't.
So the final result was defeat at both state and national level at the cost of $450 million. Significant gaps remain between the outcomes of Indigenous and other Australians, despite 5 previous Indigenous advisories to Parliament since the 70s, most states having their own Indigenous advisories, and an estimated $33.4 billion of Indigenous expenditure each year, including $6 billion on programs and services inside exclusively Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And almost all Australians still support constitutional recognition of Aboriginal Australians. It's like we're stuck in some kind of pre-Halloween time loop.
There shall be a treaty.
I will put to the Australian people a referendum to formally recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution.
In line with other Commonwealth governments who did that hundreds of years ago. But at least a few more of us are aware that we have a constitution. And we'll all forget this happened in a couple of weeks anyway, rather than try and understand it. Christinia Solich, INN News.
Thanks, Christinia. And with all that money and support for The Voice, perhaps Australians should consider other factors than idiocy, racism and misinformation for its failure, and how The Voice would have addressed the issues better than the current National Indigenous Australians Agency or the Coalition of Peaks.
The what-alition of the what?
The Coalition of Peaks.
Oh, I've never heard of the Coalition of the Peaks.
Well, they're the federal Indigenous body we already have, made up of over 80 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island groups that advise the government even though they aren't enshrined in the Constitution, sadly.
Yeah, but isn't that exactly what The Voice was supposed to do?
Well, Warren Mundine thinks so.
This is a referendum we should never have had because it was built on a lie that Aboriginal people do not have a voice. Well, the Coalition of the Peaks sits at the national cabinet, and they advise government.
But governments could ignore them, couldn't they?
And they can ignore the voice to Parliament. And so what's the difference? You know, you sort of wonder why we spent hundreds of millions of dollars when we should have actually been spending that money on those communities that are struggling.
Wow, so if the voice wasn't what Australia needed, then what is?
Perhaps that's the It John Farnham song was telling us to try and understand.